How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AITA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you.
Allison Whitmore stood by the tall windows of her Boston home, watching late afternoon light settle over the street like a careful decision. The house was quiet in the way expensive houses often were, polished, orderly, and echoing just enough to remind her that she lived there alone. In a little over a month, that would change. She was getting married. Everyone around her seemed to think this should be the happiest, most carefree stretch of her life. Her friends certainly did. "You look like you're preparing for a bar exam, not a wedding." One of them had laughed earlier that day, tilting her head as she studied Allison's face. Most brides would be floating by now. Allison had smiled, the same controlled, polite smile she used in boardrooms and charity meetings. She shrugged lightly, as if the comment barely touched her. There was no point explaining something she barely understood herself. From the outside, everything was perfect. The venue had been booked months ago. The caterer, the florist, the dress. The music, every detail was handled by professionals who were paid very well to make sure nothing went wrong. Money solved those kinds of problems easily. That wasn't what troubled her. If the issue could have been fixed with a check, Allison would have slept soundly. She knew that. She had been raised to know it. Her unease had no clear shape. It was not fear exactly, and not doubt in the way people usually meant it. It was a persistent pressure beneath her ribs. A quiet insistence that something important was unresolved. She could not name it, and that made it worse. Allison had built her adult life on identifying risks early and addressing them calmly. This feeling refused to be catalogued. She had learned that discipline from her father. Allison's mother had died when she was barely old enough to remember her. What remained of that loss lived more in photographs than in memory. Her father never remarried. He devoted himself to his daughter and to the business he had built from nothing into something formidable. From him, Allison learned two lessons that shaped her more than any formal education ever could. The first was that wealth created comfort, but it also attracted attention, often the wrong kind. The second was that trust, once given carelessly, could cost far more than money. He never spoke bitterly, never dramatized his experiences. He didn't have to. The caution in his voice, the pauses before certain decisions, the way he observed people before allowing them close, all of it taught her what he expected her to understand. People did not always want you. Sometimes they wanted what you had, and the two could look dangerously similar. Allison absorbed those lessons thoroughly. She excelled in school, then abroad, where her father sent her to study, partly for education and partly for safety. She learned to rely on herself, to think several steps ahead, to appear composed even when she felt uncertain. By the time she returned to Boston as an adult, she was already skilled at being alone without appearing lonely. And yet, standing on the threshold of marriage, loneliness pressed in on her more sharply than it had in years. She was surrounded by people, friends, colleagues, acquaintances who congratulated her with warm smiles and well-worn phrases, but there was no one she felt she could speak to honestly about the tension she carried. It seemed ungrateful to admit it. After all, she had everything most people wanted: security, success, a beautiful home, and a man who appeared devoted to her. So she kept quiet. In public, Allison was the image of a composed bride-to-be. In private, she moved through her days with careful efficiency, attending meetings, reviewing documents, answering emails late into the night. Work gave her structure. Silence gave her room to think, though her thoughts rarely settled. At times, she caught herself wishing her father were still alive, not to interfere, not to approve or disapprove, but simply to ask the questions he always asked, the ones that cut through excitement and appearances and went straight to the heart of things. Without him, she felt as though she were navigating an important crossing without a compass, relying only on instincts she wasn't sure she trusted. As the wedding date crept closer, The world around Allison seemed to grow louder with celebration, while her inner life became increasingly still. The contrast unsettled her. She told herself that nerves were normal, that many brides felt overwhelmed. But deep down, she knew this wasn't about flowers or vows or guest lists. It was about something money couldn't manage, and something she hadn't yet found the courage to name. Allison Whitmore's memories of her mother were faint and fragmentary, more impressions than scenes. A soft voice, the scent of perfume on a scarf, the blur of photographs that relatives brought out on anniversaries. Her mother had died when Allison was still very young, too young to understand permanence, but old enough for the absence to leave a hollow space that never quite filled. By the time she learned to articulate loss, it was already part of her internal landscape. Her father never remarried. Friends and business associates assumed it was a matter of choice, perhaps stubborn loyalty to a love he refused to replace. Allison eventually understood it differently. He had not only lost a wife, he had lost trust in the simplicity of affection. As his financial success grew, so did his wariness. He became careful, selective, quietly guarded, and all of that attention, all of that focus, turned toward his daughter. He raised Allison alone, but never made her feel deprived. On the contrary, he involved her in everything: conversations at the dinner table, long drives where he spoke freely about decisions and consequences, afternoons when she sat quietly in his office watching how people behaved when money was on the line. He did not shelter her from reality. He believed preparation was a form of love. What he taught her, above all else, was caution. Wealth doesn't make life easier, he told her more than once. It just makes mistakes more expensive. He never spoke in absolutes. He didn't claim everyone was dishonest or that love was impossible, but he insisted on discernment. People, he explained, often confused interest with affection, opportunity with loyalty. Allison learned to listen not just to words, but to tone, timing, and motivation. She learned that trust should be built slowly and tested quietly. Those lessons shaped her deeply. By the time she finished high school with top honors, her father had already decided she would study abroad. Allison protested at first. Boston felt like home, and the thought of leaving him alone unsettled her. But he was firm. The education would be superior, he argued, and the distance would make her stronger. More importantly, he wanted her safe, surrounded by systems that did not know her as an heiress first. She left reluctantly and applied herself with characteristic discipline. When she returned years later, more confident, more capable, eager to step fully into adult life, she found her father changed. At first, the differences were subtle. He was still upright, still sharp, still deeply engaged in his work. But doctors visited more frequently. Phone calls were taken behind closed doors. There were trips to clinics he explained away with casual remarks. Allison sensed something was wrong long before he admitted it. When she finally confronted him, he didn't deny the truth. It was cancer, advanced enough to be serious, uncertain enough to allow for hope. He spoke calmly, reassuring her that he had the best doctors, the best treatment options. He dismissed her suggestions of experimental care abroad, insisting that the business could not be left unattended. Allison had only just begun to take on greater responsibility, and he did not believe it was time to place everything on her shoulders. "I need to know you're secure," he told her once, during a long evening conversation that stretched past midnight. Not just financially, personally. It was then that he began to speak openly about her future marriage. He asked careful questions about the man she was seeing, about his background, his ambitions, his family. He never criticized outright. Instead, he expressed concern in measured phrases, emphasizing how easily intentions could be misunderstood when money was involved. He worried aloud that Allison, accustomed to independence, might mistake attentiveness for devotion. Allison tried to reassure him. She told him she was being careful. that she had learned from him. She avoided details that might alarm him unnecessarily. Still, she could see the fear beneath his composed exterior. It wasn't fear for himself. It was fear of leaving her alone in a world he knew could be unkind. His health declined faster than either of them expected. In the end, there were no dramatic scenes, no final revelations. Just quiet days in a hospital room, conversations interrupted by fatigue, and a growing awareness that time was running out. When he died, Allison felt as though the last solid structure in her life had vanished. The funeral passed in a blur of condolences and formalities. People spoke warmly of her father's achievements, his integrity, his generosity. Allison accepted their words with grace, but inside, she felt unmoored. For the first time, there was no one who truly knew her history, no one whose approval she didn't have to earn. In the weeks that followed, she returned to work, to routines, to the familiar rhythm of responsibility. Outwardly, she functioned well. Inwardly, the loss settled into her like a quiet weight. She was no longer someone's daughter being guided and protected. She was entirely on her own. And as she moved closer to marriage, that absence became impossible to ignore. Allison Whitmore met Victor Hale on an ordinary afternoon that did not announce its importance. She had stepped out of her office for a short break, walking to a small cafe she favored for its quiet tables and lack of curiosity. It was a place where people minded their own business, where no one lingered long enough to ask questions. Allison valued that. She had already taken her seat when Victor approached, holding a cup of coffee and a book tucked under his arm. There were no empty tables left. He asked, politely and without insistence, if he might sit across from her. Allison hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. It would have felt awkward to refuse over something so small. At first, neither of them spoke. Victor opened his book, and Allison returned to her thoughts. It might have ended there if not for a brief, almost amused comment Victor made about the author he was reading. Allison glanced up, surprised. She knew the book well, and did not particularly like it. Her response came easily, unguarded. He laughed, not in mockery, but in relief, as if pleased to have encountered someone who shared his opinion. The conversation unfolded without effort. They spoke about literature, then about travel, then about the quiet habits people formed when they lived alone. Victor listened attentively, responding with questions that felt genuine rather than performative. There was no urgency in him, no sense that he was trying to impress or extract information. Allison noticed that she had forgotten to check the time. When she finally did, she realized she had stayed far longer than intended. She apologized, explaining she had to return to work. Victor smiled and apologized in return for taking up her time, for talking too much, for assuming she would be interested at all. The courtesy felt natural, uncalculated. Before they parted, he asked if she would like to continue the conversation another evening. Allison surprised herself by saying yes. They met again that same week, then again shortly after. The rhythm of their meetings felt unforced, guided more by curiosity than by expectation. Victor spoke about his work without boasting, mentioning that he managed a regional branch of a larger company tied to his family's interests. He did not dwell on numbers or status. When Allison spoke about her own responsibilities, he listened without probing, without shifting the focus to what her position might imply. That restraint mattered to her. Over time, Allison noticed something else that reassured her. Victor did not ask for favors, introductions, or access. He never hinted at needing help or leveraging her connections. When she paid for dinner once without thinking, he accepted it easily, and the next time, he insisted on paying himself, with no trace of wounded pride. The balance felt comfortable. If Victor was curious about her wealth, he hid it well. As their relationship deepened, Allison found herself relaxing in ways she had not anticipated. She still kept certain details to herself, still measured her words carefully, but the effort required to do so diminished. Victor did not challenge her independence or try to insert himself into her routines. Instead, he adapted to them, fitting neatly into the spaces she allowed. When he proposed, it felt like a continuation rather than a disruption. There was no dramatic gesture, no audience. Just a quiet evening, a thoughtful conversation about the future, and a question asked with steady confidence. Allison did not hesitate long before accepting. The decision felt reasonable, supported by evidence rather than impulse. She did, however, ask for time. 3 months, she said. Time to prepare properly, to manage commitments at work, to adjust. Victor looked briefly surprised, then nodded. He did not argue or question her motives. He said he understood. That understanding eased her lingering unease, at least on the surface. In the days that followed, Allison told herself that her caution was simply habit. After all, nothing about Victor's behavior suggested hidden motives. He was attentive without being possessive, confident without arrogance. If there were doubts, they remained indistinct, pushed aside by the steady reassurance of his presence. Still, somewhere beneath her composed exterior, Allison sensed that not all questions had been answered. She chose not to examine that feeling too closely. Victor chose his moment carefully. It was an evening without urgency. One of those quiet hours when the city outside seemed distant and Allison's attention was not divided between calls or documents. They had finished dinner, the remnants of the meal still on the table. When Victor leaned back slightly and said there was something important he needed to explain before they moved any further toward the wedding. His tone was calm, almost apologetic. He told her about his mother, Margaret Hale. Victor explained that Margaret had lost both her hearing and her speech as a child. The result of a severe illness she had survived but never fully escaped. According to him, it was not a genetic condition, nor something that could be treated or improved with modern medicine. She had simply grown up this way, adapting as best she could with the limited resources her family had at the time. She doesn't hear anything, Victor said quietly, and she can't speak. She never learned to read lips either. We communicate through sign language. He demonstrated a few simple gestures as he spoke, his hands moving with practiced ease. Allison watched closely, surprised by the fluency of his movements. There was something intimate about the way he described their communication, a private world built between two people who had learned to rely on one another. Victor went on to explain that Margaret was largely dependent on him. Living alone was difficult for her, he said, not only because of practical challenges, but because of isolation. She could not use the phone, could not easily ask for help, and often misunderstood situations where spoken language was assumed. Hotels, rentals, and short-term arrangements were especially hard. I can't leave her by herself, Victor said. Not now. Not after everything. Then came the request. After the wedding, he wanted his mother to live with them. He said it plainly, without pressure, but Allison felt the shift immediately. She listened without interrupting, keeping her expression neutral as she absorbed the implications. She had expected adjustments with marriage, shared routines, compromises, but this was different. This was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a permanent presence. Still, she did not refuse. The house was large. Space would not be an issue. Allison reminded herself of that first. She reminded herself, too, that many people struggled with far more demanding family obligations. Compared to that, this seemed manageable. Margaret would be quiet, unobtrusive. She would not interfere in conversations or create conflict. In some ways, Allison thought, it might even make things easier. I understand, she said after a brief pause. Of course she can stay with us. Victor's relief was immediate and unmistakable. He thanked her more than once. His gratitude sincere enough to soften the mild tension Allison felt in her chest. He spoke about future plans, how eventually, once certain renovations were complete, He might arrange separate accommodations with professional support for his mother. He emphasized that this arrangement did not have to be permanent. Allison nodded, accepting the explanation. She told herself that the discomfort she felt was nothing more than natural adjustment. She met Margaret the following day. Victor brought her to the house in the late afternoon. Margaret entered quietly, standing just behind her son as if unsure whether to step forward. She was striking in a subtle way, well-groomed, neatly dressed, with features that appeared younger than Allison had expected. There was no frailty about her, no visible sign of illness beyond her silence. Margaret smiled when Allison greeted her, a gentle, almost delicate expression. Her eyes were attentive, curious. Victor translated, his hands moving between them, explaining introductions, relaying pleasantries. Margaret responded with graceful gestures of her own, her movements light and fluid. Allison found herself watching Margaret's hands as much as her face. There was something calming about the exchange. Margaret did not dominate the space. She did not demand attention. She listened, if that was the right word, patiently, waiting for Victor to interpret. When she moved through the house, she did so carefully, as if trying not to leave a trace. For a moment, Allison felt almost relieved. She thought of the stories she had heard from friends about overbearing in-laws, constant criticism, endless involvement. Compared to that, this situation seemed almost ideal. Margaret would not argue or complain. She would not interfere in decisions or question Allison's choices. She would simply be there, quiet and contained. In the days that followed, their coexistence began smoothly. Margaret kept to herself, spending hours reading or arranging small personal items in her room. She smiled often, nodded politely, and never imposed. Victor continued to translate when necessary, though sometimes he waved off the effort, explaining that the conversation was of no importance. "It's just between us," he would say casually. "Nothing you need to worry about." Allison accepted this at first, telling herself that privacy between mother and son was natural. The house remained orderly, calm, almost too calm, and for a while, Allison allowed herself to believe that this new dynamic would be easy to manage, perhaps even convenient. She did not yet realize how much could be hidden in silence. As the wedding drew closer, the atmosphere in the house began to shift in ways Allison could not immediately explain. Nothing obvious changed. There were no arguments, no raised voices, no dramatic scenes that could justify the unease settling inside her. And yet, day by day, the quiet that had once felt peaceful started to feel restrictive, like a room with the windows sealed shut. Victor and Margaret spent more time together. At first, Allison barely noticed. It seemed natural that a mother and son would share private moments, especially given the limits of Margaret's world. But gradually, their conversations began to intrude into shared spaces, over breakfast in the living room, during evenings when Allison expected the three of them to sit together. Their hands moved quickly, confidently, forming sentences Allison could not follow. Victor did not always translate. Sometimes he offered a brief summary. Sometimes he smiled and said it was nothing important. And increasingly, he didn't explain at all. The two of them would exchange looks, gestures, small reactions that clearly carried meaning, while Allison sat nearby, politely silent, waiting for an opening that never came. She told herself she was being unreasonable. After all, Margaret could not communicate any other way. Victor was simply accommodating her. Still, the effect was impossible to ignore. Allison felt like a guest in her own home, present but peripheral, watching conversations unfold behind a wall she could neither see through nor climb over. One evening, after an especially long exchange between Victor and his mother, Allison finally spoke. "Could you tell me what that was about?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "It feels strange sitting here without understanding anything." Victor looked at her, his expression tightening just slightly before smoothing over. Allison. It was nothing, he said. Just something about her day. You don't need to worry. I'm not worried, she replied carefully. I just feel left out. He sighed, the sound quiet but edged with irritation. You're reading too much into it. She's disabled. This is how we communicate. You know that. The word disabled landed heavily between them. Allison felt an immediate pang of guilt. She had no desire to appear insensitive or demanding. She nodded, letting the matter drop, even though the discomfort remained. Victor leaned over and kissed her forehead, as if to close the subject. Try not to be so tense, he said. Wedding stress does strange things to people. That explanation became his answer to everything. When Allison noticed that Victor and Margaret sometimes stopped signing when she entered the room, he said she was imagining it. When she pointed out that entire conversations were happening without her, he reminded her that she wasn't obligated to understand everything. When she fell silent during meals, he suggested she was being overly sensitive. Each dismissal was gentle, reasonable on the surface. Together, they formed something harder to challenge. Allison considered confronting him more firmly. She rehearsed the words in her mind, searching for a way to express her feelings without sounding accusatory or cruel. But every attempt ended the same way, with doubt. What if she really was overreacting? What if this was simply an adjustment she needed to make? She had spent her life being careful, fair, rational. She did not want to become someone who resented a woman for her disability or demanded attention where none was owed. So Allison chose silence. Outwardly, she became more accommodating. She stopped asking questions. She avoided looking directly at Victor and Margaret when they signed, pretending to give them privacy. Her restraint seemed to reassure them. Victor relaxed. Margaret smiled at her more often, her expression unreadable. But inwardly, Allison's mind worked relentlessly. She realized that the problem was not the sign language itself. It was what it allowed. Conversations she could not hear, intentions she could not evaluate, decisions she might never know were being made. She thought of her father's warnings, of how easily trust could be manipulated when information was unevenly shared. Allison did not want to accuse. She wanted to understand. The decision came quietly, without drama or declaration. She would learn sign language, not to participate, not to insert herself into their conversations, and certainly not to reveal her efforts. She had no interest in performing or correcting them. She wanted to listen, to truly listen, for the first time since Margaret had entered her home. Finding a teacher was harder than she expected. There were few qualified instructors nearby and fewer who could adapt to her demanding schedule. After several inquiries, Allison finally arranged lessons with a retired specialist who lived not far from her house. She did not tell Victor. She framed the lessons in her own mind, not as an act of suspicion, but as preparation. If Margaret was going to remain part of her life, understanding her world was only reasonable. That was the explanation Allison repeated to herself, even as a deeper, more urgent motivation pushed her forward. For the first time since her engagement, Allison felt a sense of control returning. Silence, she had learned, could be endured, but ignorance no longer felt safe. The woman who opened the door introduced herself as Helen Brooks, and from the first moment Allison Whitmore stepped into her home, she sensed a difference that was difficult to define but immediately comforting. The house was modest, warm, and quietly lived in. There were no sharp lines or polished surfaces, no sense of display. Everything seemed arranged for use rather than appearance, as though life happened here without needing permission. Helen was already retired, her movements unhurried but precise. She spoke gently, explaining her background as a sign language instructor, her years working with both children and adults, and her willingness to adapt the lessons to Allison's schedule. There was no curiosity in her questions, no attempt to pry into why Allison wanted to learn. She accepted the request at face value, as if learning another language were the most natural thing in the world. They had barely begun their first conversation when a small boy appeared in the hallway. He was around 5 years old, with careful eyes and an open, unguarded expression. He paused when he saw Allison, clearly unsure whether to approach. Helen smiled and called him over, introducing him as Samuel, her grandson. Samuel greeted Allison politely, then looked back at his grandmother for reassurance before retreating to his room with a toy clutched in his hands. The brief interaction lingered with Allison more than she expected. The lesson itself was focused and calm. Helen explained the fundamentals of sign language with patience, demonstrating each movement clearly, correcting Allison only when necessary. Her hands were expressive, fluid despite her age, and Allison found herself recognizing patterns more quickly than she had anticipated. She was accustomed to absorbing complex information, and this was no different, except that it felt personal in a way spreadsheets and contracts never did. When the lesson ended, Allison realized she had been there far longer than planned. The next day, she returned with small gifts, a box of pastries from a nearby bakery chosen without much thought, and a soft toy she had picked up on impulse after remembering Samuel's hesitant smile. Helen accepted the offerings with mild embarrassment, insisting they were unnecessary. But Samuel's reaction erased any lingering doubt. He hugged the toy tightly and thanked Allison with shy sincerity. From then on, the visits developed a quiet rhythm. Allison continued her lessons, and each time she arrived, Samuel was there, sometimes drawing at the kitchen table, sometimes watching cartoons with the sound turned low. He grew used to her presence quickly, greeting her with increasing confidence. Allison found herself looking forward to those moments more than she cared to admit. One afternoon, during a break between exercises, Helen spoke about her life. She had been widowed many years earlier, she explained, her voice steady but reserved. Her son, Thomas, had gone north to work several years ago, taking a job in a remote region where opportunities were scarce but wages were higher. At first, he had called regularly, then less often, and finally not at all. Search efforts had yielded nothing conclusive. Officially, he was listed as missing. Unofficially, many people assumed he was dead. "I don't believe that," Helen said quietly. "Not completely." She spoke without bitterness, without dramatics. It was clear she had repeated this story many times, each retelling wearing down the sharpest edges of grief. Samuel, she added, had been left in her care after his mother died during childbirth. The boy had never known his parents together. Helen had become his entire world. Allison listened without interruption. She did not offer empty reassurances or platitudes. She simply acknowledged the story, letting it exist without trying to resolve it. Helen seemed to appreciate that. As the weeks passed, Allison's progress accelerated. She practiced not only the gestures, but the expressions that accompanied them. Helen emphasized that understanding sign language was as much about reading faces as hands. Allison absorbed this instinctively, her attention sharp, her motivation intense. Sometimes Helen would speak using only signs and Allison would concentrate, piecing together meaning without assistance. She was learning how to listen in an entirely new way. At home, Allison said nothing about her lessons. She continued to avoid watching Victor and Margaret when they signed, careful not to reveal her growing comprehension. That restraint, ironically, made her seem more detached, more accommodating. Victor appeared satisfied. Margaret smiled at her often. What Allison did not yet recognize was how much the time at Helen's house had begun to matter to her. There, she was not an heiress, not a fiancé, not a problem to be managed or a presence to be ignored. She was simply someone who showed up, who learned, who brought small kindnesses without expectation. Samuel waited for her visits, and Helen treated her with a quiet respect that did not depend on status or wealth. The emotional connection formed gradually, almost invisibly. Allison told herself she was only there to learn a language, but something deeper was already taking shape, unnoticed, steady and waiting. By the time Allison Whitmore fully understood sign language, no one in the house suspected it. She had reached that point, gradually, without any clear marker to announce it. One day, gestures that once appeared abstract began to resolve into meaning. Expressions aligned with motion. Pauses carried weight. She no longer needed to translate word by word. She understood the intent beneath the movements, the rhythm of thought passing from one person to another, and she said nothing. At home, Allison remained careful. When Victor and Margaret spoke with their hands, she continued to avert her eyes, as if respecting their privacy. She busied herself with work documents, with her phone, with small tasks that allowed her to seem present but disengaged. The act required discipline, but she had been trained for restraint long before this. Her apparent indifference had an effect. Victor relaxed. He stopped censoring himself. Margaret, too, appeared more at ease, no longer pausing when Allison entered the room. Their conversations resumed freely, unfolding in shared spaces as though Allison were not there at all. That was when Allison began to see the pattern. At first, the exchanges were mundane, comments about meals, schedules, minor irritations. But beneath them ran a thread of impatience, of dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with disability or circumstance. Margaret's gestures grew sharper, more expressive. Victor responded with familiarity that no longer resembled filial respect. One evening, Allison entered the living room quietly, expecting to retrieve a folder she had left on the table. Victor and Margaret were seated close together, their attention fully on one another. They did not notice her at first. Allison stopped. Margaret was signing rapidly, her face animated in a way Allison had never seen before. There was irritation there, no. Frustration. Victor answered with a dismissive flick of his hand, then leaned closer, signing something that made Margaret scoff softly. Allison understood every word. Margaret complained about the role she was forced to play, about the exhaustion of pretending to be helpless, of limiting herself to silence. She expressed resentment at being treated as fragile, at having to maintain the illusion day after day. Victor responded by telling her it would all be worth it soon. That patience was necessary, that timing mattered. They spoke of money, not vaguely, not indirectly, but with clear intent. They discussed assets, inheritance, what would become accessible after the wedding. Victor referenced Allison's accounts, her properties, the legal bindings marriage would create. Margaret asked how long they would have to continue living in this house, how long before they could leave with what they wanted. Then came the moment Allison could not explain away. Margaret signed something that made Victor laugh, a brief, private reaction. Allison felt a cold clarity settle over her as she read the words. Margaret referred to Victor not as a son, but as a partner. She spoke of their arrangement, of how convincing their performance had been, of how easily sympathy had been manufactured. They were not mother and son. They were accomplices. Allison's breath caught, but she did not move. She did not make a sound. Her body felt strangely light, as though shock had disconnected sensation from thought. The pieces aligned with terrifying precision. The inconsistencies she had dismissed, the unease she had tried to suppress, it all resolved into something undeniable. Victor glanced up then, finally noticing her presence. Allison forced herself to smile. She asked, casually, whether they had seen her folder. Victor answered without hesitation, speaking aloud now, his voice smooth and unconcerned. He gestured vaguely toward the table. Margaret smiled at Allison, the same gentle expression she had worn from the beginning. Allison retrieved the folder and left the room. Only once she had closed the door to her bedroom did she allow herself to react. Even then, the response was contained. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, and stared at the wall. Her mind moved quickly, cataloging facts, assessing risk. Confrontation was not an option. She understood instinctively that revealing her knowledge would place her in danger. These were not people who had stumbled into deceit. They were practiced, calculated, and entirely willing to exploit vulnerability if they learned that their secret was exposed. She could not predict how far they might go to protect themselves. Allison chose silence again, but this time it was deliberate. She did not cry. She did not rage. She allowed no outward sign of the devastation spreading through her chest. Instead, she began to plan. The wedding date, the financial ties, the legal consequences, all of it replayed in her mind with new urgency. Trust, once broken, left no room for hesitation. Allison had heard what was never meant for her to understand. Now, she would decide what to do with it. Allison Whitmore did not act impulsively. The morning after she understood the truth, she moved through her routine with careful precision. She answered emails, attended a scheduled meeting, and spoke to Victor as she always had, calm, attentive, unchanged. Nothing in her expression suggested that the foundation of her life had fractured overnight. By the afternoon, she had arranged a private meeting at the local police precinct. She came prepared. Allison explained everything in a measured, factual manner. She described Victor Hale, Margaret Hale, the false claims of disability, the use of sign language as a cover for private conversations, and the explicit discussion she had witnessed regarding money and marriage. She did not dramatize her account or appeal to sympathy. She presented timelines, addresses, financial details, and observations with the same clarity she used in business negotiations. The detective listening to her grew noticeably still. When Allison finished, there was a pause, not of disbelief but of recognition. The detective exchanged a glance with a colleague, then asked several precise questions. Had Victor and Margaret lived in other cities before Boston? Had there been previous engagements or abrupt departures? Had Allison noticed inconsistencies in their personal histories? She answered honestly. What followed confirmed her worst suspicions. The authorities had been tracking a group that operated across multiple states, using nearly identical methods. One member would pose as a dependent family figure, often disabled, often elderly, while the other cultivated a relationship with a financially secure target. Sympathy, urgency, and privacy formed the core of the scheme. Victor and Margaret fit the pattern exactly. You did the right thing coming in, the detective said, and you did it in time. Allison did not feel relief, only a steady, quiet resolve. The arrests happened 2 days later. Allison was not present when the police came to her house. She had arranged to be at the office, giving the authorities unrestricted access. There was no confrontation, no emotional reckoning. Victor and Margaret were taken into custody without resistance. The house, which had once felt compromised and claustrophobic, was suddenly empty. That evening, Allison returned home alone. She walked through each room deliberately, opening windows, turning on lights, reclaiming space. She packed Victor's belongings carefully and methodically, as if removing evidence rather than remnants of a relationship. Margaret's room was cleared last. Allison did not linger there. She sealed the boxes and arranged for everything to be removed the next morning. Only when the house was completely silent again did she allow herself to breathe. The following day, Allison drove to Helen Brooks's home. She had rehearsed the explanation in her mind, unsure how much to say or how to frame the truth. When Helen opened the door, Allison immediately sensed something was wrong. Helen looked pale, her movements slower, her posture less steady than usual. Still, she smiled and welcomed Allison inside. Allison told her everything. She explained why she had wanted to learn sign language, what she had discovered, and how the deception had unfolded. Helen listened without interruption, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. then to quiet sorrow. When Allison finished, Helen reached for her hand. "You were right to be careful," she signed slowly, "and brave to act." They spoke for a while longer, but Helen grew visibly fatigued. Allison insisted on calling a doctor, but Helen waved off the concern, saying it was only exhaustion. Allison left reluctantly, unsettled by the sense that something fragile had shifted. 2 days later, the call came. Helen had been taken to the hospital during the night. By the time Allison arrived, she was already gone. The illness, undetected and fast-moving, had taken its course before anyone could intervene. There were no long goodbyes, no chance for preparation. Samuel was left with no one. Allison handled the arrangements quietly, efficiently. She attended the funeral, standing beside the small boy who clutched her hand as if it were the only solid thing left. In the days that followed, she worked through the legal steps necessary to ensure Samuel would not be displaced or sent into temporary care. Assuming responsibility for him did not feel like a choice. It felt inevitable. Allison brought Samuel home with her, adjusting routines, rearranging spaces, making room not just physically, but emotionally. The house that had once been filled with deception now held something else entirely. Grief, yes, but also purpose. For the first time since her father's death, Allison was no longer alone, and she was no longer running from silence. The weeks that followed Helen Brooks's death pressed down on Allison Whitmore with unrelenting weight. Guardianship papers, meetings with family court representatives, and arrangements for Samuel's schooling filled her days. Nights were worse. Samuel slept restlessly, waking from dreams he could not explain. Reaching for reassurance Allison was still learning how to give. She did her best, steady routines, gentle words, presence, but exhaustion settled into her bones. At the same time, the company began to falter. Allison noticed the signs first in the margins. Missed targets that made no sense, contracts delayed without explanation, numbers that failed to align across reports. She dug deeper, reviewing accounts late into the night after Samuel had fallen asleep. The pattern sharpened quickly. Funds had been redirected. Decisions she had not approved were recorded as if they were routine. Information had been leaking to competitors with unsettling precision. The betrayal cut deep. The trail led to someone she had trusted for years. Her deputy, a man who had worked closely with her father and had long enjoyed Allison's confidence. When she confronted him with questions, he responded smoothly, defensively, insisting on misunderstandings and temporary market pressures. He requested a meeting of the board, suggested calm, and urged her not to overreact. Allison scheduled the meeting. She never made it. The accident happened on a clear morning, the kind that invited distraction. Allison was driving to the office, rehearsing the points she intended to raise, when another vehicle struck her from the side at an intersection she crossed daily. The impact was sudden and violent. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. Then there was silence. She woke in a hospital bed, her body heavy and distant, pain radiating from her spine like a warning she could not escape. Doctors spoke carefully, explaining injuries, outlining possibilities. The words blurred together until one fact remained unmistakable. She could not move her legs. The diagnosis was severe spinal trauma. Surgery was discussed, then deferred. Stabilization first, they said. Observation. Time. Allison listened without interruption, nodding as if the outcome were already decided. Inside, something essential folded in on itself. When the investigation into the crash concluded weeks later, the truth emerged with brutal clarity. The collision had not been random. Evidence from traffic cameras and vehicle data confirmed it. Her deputy had orchestrated it, calculating that removing Allison would allow him to seize control of the company outright. He was arrested, charged, and publicly disgraced. Justice arrived too late to feel like comfort. Allison returned home in a wheelchair, the house altered to accommodate her new reality. Samuel stayed close, watching her with wide, anxious eyes. He sensed the shift even when she tried to mask it. Allison's patience thinned, her temper frayed. She hated the dependence, the vulnerability, the fear that crept in whenever she imagined Samuel being taken from her care. Depression settled quietly. She told herself she was being practical. The doctors spoke of surgery, of rehabilitation that could take years with no guarantees. Allison heard risk where others heard hope. She calculated costs, time, energy, resources she felt she no longer possessed. Better to accept the limitations, she reasoned. Better to plan for a controlled, diminished life than to gamble what remained on uncertainty. It was during this lowest point that the man arrived. He came without announcement, standing at the threshold of her home with a stack of documents in his hands. He introduced himself simply, Thomas Brooks, Helen's son, Samuel's father. Allison studied him with guarded disbelief. She had heard Helen's story, the disappearance, the years without contact. She had buried the woman who believed her son was still alive. Now here he was, solid, scarred, unmistakably real. Thomas did not argue or plead. He placed the documents on the table, explaining quietly where he had been and why it had taken so long to return. He spoke of working in a remote northern region, of an accident that left him injured and disoriented, of months lost to recovery and isolation. Communication had failed. Memory had fractured. By the time he found his way back, years had passed. Allison listened, unmoved by drama, attentive to details. Thomas did not ask for money. He did not demand custody. He asked only to see his son. Samuel recognized him slowly, cautiously, clinging to Allison at first, then inching closer as fragments of memory surfaced. Thomas was patient, never forcing the connection, allowing trust to rebuild at its own pace. When they were alone, Thomas addressed the subject Allison had been avoiding. "You're giving up," he said calmly, not accusing, observant. Allison bristled, insisting she was being realistic. She listed risks, statistics, probabilities. She spoke of dignity, of not wanting to become a burden. Thomas listened until she finished, then told her his own story of lying in a remote cabin, barely able to move, with no certainty he would survive, let alone return to the life he'd lost. "I didn't know if I'd walk again," he said, "but I worked anyway, because doing nothing would have killed me faster." The words lingered. Thomas did not promise miracles. He did not minimize her fear. He challenged the idea that surrender was the same as acceptance. He pointed to Samuel, to the fragile stability they had built together, to the future Allison was quietly abandoning. "You don't have to decide everything today," he said, "but don't decide to disappear." That night, Allison lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since the accident, the possibility of trying, truly trying, entered her thoughts. It frightened her. It also stirred something she had believed was gone. Resolve. By morning, she asked Thomas to help her gather information. Not commitments, not promises, just facts. It was a small step, but it was the first one back toward life. Allison Whitmore did not agree to surgery in a rush. She gathered information the way she always had, methodically without illusion. She requested second and third opinions, reviewed imaging reports, listened to specialists explain risks and probabilities in precise language. There were no guarantees. Recovery would be long, the outcome uncertain. Even success, they warned, might not mean a full return to the life she once knew. Allison accepted that. What changed was not the data, but her willingness to engage with it. Thomas did not pressure her. He attended consultations only when she asked questions only when she invited them. Samuel waited at home, drawing pictures and asking when she would come back, his concern expressed in small, earnest ways that reached her more deeply than reassurance ever could. In the end, Allison made the decision herself. She signed the consent forms without ceremony, her hand steady. She told herself that choosing surgery was not a promise of success, but a refusal to disappear quietly. That distinction mattered. It allowed her to move forward without demanding certainty from a future that had already proven unpredictable. The surgery was difficult. When she woke afterward, pain blurred the edges of consciousness, and doubt crept in almost immediately. The first days were the hardest. Movement felt impossible. Progress was measured in millimeters, not milestones. There were moments, private, unguarded moments, when Allison wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Thomas was there. He did not offer constant encouragement or empty optimism. He sat with her through the slow hours, read reports when her eyes grew tired, and spoke honestly about setbacks. When Samuel visited, Thomas managed the balance carefully, allowing the boy to see effort without exposing him to despair. Samuel brought drawings and told stories about school, anchoring Allison to a world that continued whether she was ready or not. Rehabilitation began quietly and became relentless. Physical therapy demanded repetition, patience, and humility. There were days when Allison advanced and days when she seemed to slide backward. She learned to tolerate frustration without surrendering to it. The therapists did not promise miracles. They insisted on consistency. So did Thomas. Recovery reshaped Allison's understanding of strength. It was no longer about control or efficiency. It was about persistence, showing up when the outcome remained unclear, choosing effort over resignation. As her body slowly responded, her mind reawakened to responsibilities she had set aside. From her hospital bed, Allison began reaching out to the company. At first, the conversations were brief. Then they lengthened. She asked questions, reviewed reports, requested meetings. The tone shifted almost immediately. Some executives mistook her early involvement for symbolic interest, a temporary distraction. Allison corrected that assumption swiftly. She called meetings from the hospital, appearing composed, focused, unmistakably present. When she returned home, she continued the work there, seated at a desk that had been adapted to her needs. The staff noticed the change. The hesitation that had crept in after her accident gave way to recognition. Allison was not waiting to be replaced. She was reclaiming her position. Trust, she knew, would not return overnight. She rebuilt it carefully, through decisions that demonstrated accountability rather than promises of reform. She replaced those who had failed her father and her. She tightened oversight, reestablished boundaries, and made it clear that loyalty was measured by conduct, not history. Slowly, the company stabilized. At home, change arrived more quietly. Allison's relationship with Thomas evolved without declarations. They spoke openly, disagreed respectfully, and allowed space for uncertainty. Thomas never positioned himself as her rescuer. He encouraged independence, celebrated effort, and stepped back when she needed to prove something to herself. Samuel thrived in the structure they created together. He adapted easily, moving between school, therapy visits, and evenings spent reading or drawing at the kitchen table. He watched Allison closely, absorbing lessons she never explicitly taught, that recovery was possible, that adults could fail and still choose to continue. One evening, months after the surgery, Thomas asked Allison to walk with him. Not far, not dramatically, just a few steps. She stood, unassisted, her body responding with effort rather than fear. The movement was slow and imperfect, but it was hers. When she finished, she did not look for applause. She sat down, breathing steadily, and felt something close to peace. Thomas proposed later without spectacle. There was no speech rehearsed in advance, no claim that love would fix what had been broken. He spoke of partnership, of shared responsibility, of choosing one another without expectation of perfection. He acknowledged the past without dwelling on it and asked Allison to build a future that respected both of their scars. She said yes. The wedding was simple. On the day itself, the space was filled with quiet anticipation rather than noise. When Allison stood to walk down the aisle, there was no assistance offered or accepted. She moved at her own pace, each step deliberate, supported not by hands but by resolve. Thomas waited without urgency, watching her approach with pride rather than relief. Samuel stood beside him, solemn and attentive. Afterward, as the celebration settled into calm conversation and shared smiles, Allison felt the absence of fear that had once defined her choices. Life had not become easier. It had become clearer. In reflecting on everything she had endured, Allison understood truths she wished she had learned sooner. Wealth did not protect her from betrayal. Silence had hidden cruelty for a time, but patience had revealed it. Healing had not come through miracles or shortcuts, but through courage, quiet, consistent, and unremarkable in its persistence. And family, she had learned, was not guaranteed by blood alone. It was built through responsibility, presence, and the willingness to stay. For those listening to this story, consider the questions it leaves behind. Have you ever trusted the wrong person and learned too late? And when life tried to break you, what helped you stand back up?